Well, to look at today's issues in federal politics, I'm joined now by three observers from the different parties. Susan Smith is a Liberal observer, Ashton Arsenault is a Conservative, and Marcella Munro is a longtime NDPer. All three of you, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us, Martin.
Okay,
Thanks.
let's start. Susan Smith, I want to start with a phone call that the Prime Minister made last night to French President Emmanuel Macron. In the official transcript from the PMO, we learned that he assured the French President of the importance and his defense of the freedom of expression. And this, of course, relates to the reaction that the Prime Minister had of the beheading and the attacks in France concerning what French authorities are describing as Muslim extremists who have beheaded one person for his use, showing his students that infamous cartoon of the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. This all relates to the fact that the Prime Minister was asked to comment on it. Last Friday, he commented on it, and he's been getting a lot of heat on it. Susan Smith, how do you react to the fact that the Prime Minister is on the phone last night to the French President, and he's being accused of being lukewarm in his defense of freedom of speech?
Well, not anymore. I think the Prime Minister has, he obviously condemned the terrible, terrible events that happened in France, but he misspoke, I think, and he talked about, you can't just say anything from a free speech perspective. You can't stand up and say fire in a movie theater. And that didn't go over very well. And he has since clarified it. He's clarified it publicly in Canada. And he had a conversation with President Macron. Look, Canada's relations with France are exceptionally strong. There is no one that doubts that our Prime Minister, or any Canadian Prime Minister for that matter, would condone limits on free speech in the sense of, or freedom of expression in the sense, as long as it doesn't contradict Canadian criminal law. And absolutely, Canada and Canadians, I think, stand in solidarity with their French friends for the terrible tragedies.
But we had the spectacle, though, of Emmanuel Macron calling the Quebec Premier, François Legault, who this week said he disagreed with Mr. Trudeau and agreed totally in defending the French president's right and the right of French citizens. And he got a phone call from President Macron. Has there been damage to French-Canadian diplomatic relations?
Well, Mr. Macron, our Prime Minister, Premier Legault, got a call from the French president right after the terrible tragedies as well in Quebec City with the Halloween massacres. So there are two jurisdictions that have had terrible tragedies take place, both very, very violent. Yeah, of course, there's probably politics that was in play there, but I don't think there's anything really significant to be read in it in the even the short-term or the long-term relations when it comes to Canada and France.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Ashton Arsenault, your reaction to how this is all played out?
Yeah, look, another unforced error by the Prime Minister, and adds to a litany of unforced errors when it comes to international relationships with foreign leaders. I think the Prime Minister, at the end of the day, has a bit of a tenuous relationship with free speech. It seems to me at certain times his definition is free speech is all fine and well so long as it doesn't offend anybody. In reality, that is not how free speech is defined. There has been Supreme Court cases on this. It's very well understood that free speech means that you do have the ability to offend. Of course, you don't have the ability to incite violence or hatred. But I think this situation was bungled right from the get-go. And just going back to the phone call, this phone call should have taken place a week ago. So basically, a fire has been allowed to brew for a week when a simple fix could have been achieved right away. And I just feel like it's just a complete unforced error, and there's really no excuse for it.
Okay, Marcella Munro, what do you make of all of this?
I think that the Prime Minister has had a tendency in the past, and I think this is just an example where he maybe doesn't read the room on issues as they arise. I mean, I was quite surprised by his initial reaction. I'm obviously glad that he's come around and clarified his belief and his strong support both for the French people and for freedom of speech. These issues are, tenuous, not the issue in France, which has caused the violence. But I think that we do need to remember that lots of Canadians, especially those who are people of color and Indigenous, are feeling that they have a rising vulnerability, and that that speech patterns, that hatred, that racist bigotry is becoming a little more tolerated. And so I wondered when I saw it, though I disagreed with it, I wondered if that was playing in the Prime Minister's mind a little bit. So, I'm a big believer in freedom of speech. I don't disagree with anything your other two guests have said. But I do think in this moment we need to realize that this is a very tenuous subject for a lot of Canadians, and that might have been part of what his thinking was.
Okay, I wanted to get to another issue which has really raised a lot of political questions. That is, we saw yesterday Ontario, province of 14.6 million, 14.5 million people, in the midst of a pandemic, delivered a pandemic budget. A lot of people, a lot of commentators and some politicians are saying if Ontario can deliver a budget in the middle of a pandemic, why can't Ottawa? Provinces have a lot of challenges with their finances, trying to figure out where this pandemic's going. They're the ones who are responsible for the majority of spending on healthcare, and yet Ontario managed to produce a budget. Susan Smith, that's the question being asked of federal Liberals. Why are we only getting an economic statement and not a budget? How do you respond to that?
Well, we are getting an economic statement, and yes, we haven't had a budget this year. I expect one in February or March next year, but I think the reality of it is that the pandemic keeps moving. We had a throne speech where the priority was very clear and remains clear: help Canadians, attack the virus and the pandemic, figure out how we can manage that from a health perspective, and then get to economic recovery. Challenge is we're in the middle of a second wave again, and the goalposts from a pandemic perspective keep moving. I understand people are frustrated. I think there's transparency when it comes to committees. The public procurement office is posting contracts and things like that. I know people would like a budget, but it isn't just one jurisdiction like Ontario is. It's the whole country, and the whole game keeps moving and the whole thing keeps changing. Ontario's not responsible for the airline sector, not responsible for the national travel or the tourism sector. The federal government has given them money for healthcare and other issues to be able to make these kinds of allocations. But I think it's a bigger picture, it's a national story. And so I think that's why there's been some reluctance to put a budget forth at this point in the game, because the ball keeps moving when it comes to the pandemic. Okay,
Ashton Arsenault, from a Conservative point of view, what do you make of it?
Well, I actually think Susan's right on the goalpost statement, frankly. I think, initially the federal government would have thought, maybe by now things would be improving. Well, we're right in the middle of the second wave, depending on who you listen to, maybe even the third wave. So, I think give due credit to the Ford government yesterday for putting out a budget that I think was rather thoughtful. I do think the fall economic statement that the federal government releases is going to be a little bit more robust than a normal fall economic statement, which is a relatively new phenomenon, might I add. But I would expect a more traditional budget very early in the new year, commensurate with 2021. What my concern is will there be any sort of fiscal restraint? And thus far, it does not look like the federal government is going to anchor it in any way, shape, or form. And I believe that, businesses, Canadians, they need to be protected, they need to be supported. Very unusual time, unprecedented situation. But based on the lingo that I'm hearing from the federal government right now, it looks like that is way far off in the future, and it's not something they're currently thinking about. And that's a concern to me.
Okay, Marcella Munro, from an NDP point of view, content to just have an economic statement, or should there be a full-fledged budget, or is it what's in it that matters?
Well, I think obviously we're in a different situation federally than they are here in Ontario with the minority government situation. So, of course, anything they put in front of Parliament, the federal government wants to make sure they're going to have the confidence of the House. And, of course, a budget is an instant confidence motion. So there may be a little dynamic at play there. Listen, I think the most important things to be looking for is, I agree with Ashton, there will be a more substantive fall economic statement. But I also think what we need from this government is a lot more transparency. We heard the budget office this week calling for more transparency on some of the spending plans for the federal government. So I suspect that will be part of what folks are looking for. And then, I think there's a dance going on right now between the New Democrats and the Liberals to figure out in this next tranche of spending what are some of the trade-offs that they're going to be willing to make if they, in fact, don't want another election.
Okay. Well, listen, all three of you, thank you very much. We will watch that, and that will obviously be a perennial issue. We'll watch as the date approaches. Ashton Arsenault, Marcella Munro, Susan Smith, thanks very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. My pleasure.